Good afternoon, I'm Tracy Mandel. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of New Hampshire. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the sort of work that we do in my lab, which focuses on flow, mostly turbulent and high energy flows at ocean margins. So our research is primarily experimental. We do lab experiments, but we do have some projects in the preliminary stages that incorporate field observations. So here I'm going to give you a very brief snapshot about 3 different research questions that my group is currently studying. The first question is how can we remotely monitor seagrass meadows? Then we'll talk about how do seasonal changes in salt marsh plants affect their protective coastal benefits. And finally, I'll talk briefly about the upwelling signature of glacial discharge plumes and what that might be able to tell us about glacier dynamics and melting. So for this first question of how can we remotely monitor seagrass meadows, perhaps their health, perhaps the flow through them, let's first talk about the sort of tools that we use. So when we're trying to study the dynamics of flow through seagrass in the lab, we often use a variety of different model vegetation and place it in an open channel flume like the one that's showed here, where we can subject that model vegetation to waves and currents. And while we use more advanced instruments and techniques to study this flow, I will play a video here that shows a dye release demonstration that allows us to just visualize what's happening in the flow. So our flow here is from left to right, and we can see when we release some dye in a vertical line that we have slower moving water within our model seagrass meadow and faster flow above it. So if we want to be able to kind of observe these dynamics or maybe the properties of the seagrass meadow remotely, then we need to understand how the flow structures they generate impact the water surface. So what I'm showing in this figure on the upper panel is a cartoon of these sort of swirling fluid structures that are generated by flow through seagrass, and then the way that their periodic motion can show up in the water surface slope. So that's what I'm showing on the bottom 2 panels. We have kind of a bird's eye view of the top of the water surface, and we see these kind of periodic structures appearing. So this is some previous work. I'm currently PI on a project funded by ONR to understand how this surface signature might vary with different types of model vegetation, something that's perhaps more realistic and similar to the seagrass that we'd see in different areas on the coast. And we also want to know how these sort of surface observations might connect with the interior acoustic field. So I'm working with Dr. Gabe Benegas, who is another new faculty member here, to understand how if we were to seed our model seagrass blades with bubbles to kind of mimic the photosynthetic bubbles that would occur in real seagrass beds, we want to understand how the motion of this model vegetation also alters the acoustics of this problem. And finally, although much of my research focuses on coastal vegetation, I'm also interested in processes that happen at other kind of boundaries of the ocean, and interested in how surface signatures of complex subsurface processes can yield clues to those processes. We're currently spinning up a project to study this sort of turbulent plume pool that's generated by meltwater discharge that is released at the base of marine terminating glaciers, as shown here. And so if you look from the top, you get this sort of plume pool at the face of the glacier, and it has a distinct shape, and it also shows a great deal of sort of upwelling and this very energetic flow at the water surface. As you can imagine, doing field work in this sort of place is very dangerous. You have the risk of the ice face calving if you're in the water there. And so we want to do some controlled laboratory experiments where we can hopefully understand how the surface signature of that turbulent, buoyant freshwater plume might relate to the flow rate of the meltwater discharge off the glacier, perhaps the melt rate of the glacier face itself, or the final fate and transport of that plume water. So just to summarize, the flow at coastal and marginal zones is fascinating. It's economically important, whether to coastal protection or the ecosystem services that these environments provide, but many unknowns remain. So thanks for your time, and I hope to chat with you later on.